team in the South till the Falcons came to Atlanta in 1960.
Hmm.
And the other thing is we got 1 billion colleges up north. Some are great, some are less than great, but it's all diffused. What I noticed is why you have many, many small schools, private schools, parochial colleges. You have 2 or 3 major universities in Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, Florida, and huge numbers for generations have gone to those schools, in state or out of state.
Oh yeah.
And families, probably your own family, Alabama fans, and cousin marries a boy from Auburn, and it's a whole to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it's
Had that in our family.
been watching this Netflix thing, Heart from of Dixie. It's a New York girl. This is an interesting. It's a little playful, and she's a lawyer. A doctor, and she comes to this little town, and it's supposed to be near Mobile, Alabama. And the mayor is this huge African American guy who was a linebacker for Alabama and played pro ball. It's all a story.
Mm-hmm.
And he starts dating this lovely girl in town whose grandfather was a running back from Auburn. And so they just think it's fun. It's just fun. But I think it is really part and parcel of the fact that we didn't have a lot of pro football or baseball until the last 2 or 3 decades. So,
well, also for a lot of the towns in the South, that football was about the only game in town, so to speak. It really was a rallying point for the town. But I was particularly became a fan of Alabama because I was ended up on the faculty for 32 years, and then had an office on campus another 10 years. So I was pretty much, and then still lived in Alabama. We did in much of the time till we moved out here.
What did you teach?
Well, I was in biological sciences and taught a number of things over the years, but mostly taught the last quite a few years in various aspects of toxicology and the causes and prevention of birth defects.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
I enjoyed it.
Oh, well, that's wonderful. Just want to reassure everyone who's listening, and Mary Ellen especially, that we are not changing the topic tonight to football. We're just having a preliminary conversation, but we will. Ron and I are enjoying a conversation about Alabama, and at any rate, I hope everyone's been well. It's been quite a week here. We're still here. Bob, how are you tonight?
Rabbi, how are you?
Fine.
Great.
Wonderful. It's been quite a week around here, hasn't it?
Very much so. We're trying to get a vaccine, and we went a couple places, and we're going to try to find one tomorrow or next day. Yeah,
it's coming.
I know. Everybody's waiting.
Well, a little bit longer.
I know.
It's the old. To me, this is my take on it, because Judy wants to be on the phone every 5 minutes, and friends of ours stayed in their car from midnight till 5 a.m. or 8 a.m. And my take on it is it's hurry up and wait.
Right.
And we wait. And all of a sudden, as the production ramps up, come another few weeks, and we'll start seeing it, and then it'll be pouring in, and it should be less a problem. But it's been a long haul for almost all of us.
Well, we both had appointments, so we've gotten them.
That's wonderful.
Yep.
Yeah, but slowly but surely.
We got ours through an appointment down at the Prime Osborne.
That's where my husband got it. I got mine at the hospital.
Very good. So it's already, we're starting to see some folks doing that. We're a little slower in St. Augustine, But
We have our second.
I got mine in Mandarin right here at the senior center.
That's what we're going to do that Wednesday. Yeah.
Well, I got mine Friday.
Yeah, Friday. Everyone I know seems to have gotten them there Friday.
Well, what happened was it was supposed to be for city employees, but they had so few turn up in the early part of the day that they let anybody who came get it. And then after a while, they cut it off only for city employees. Well, I lucked out. I know some others that lucked out.
At 9:30 in the morning, they wouldn't let us get in, so we left. We left 9:30 in the morning on Friday. So
I got mine at Mayo today.
9:30. They didn't start till 11. They didn't want anybody there at 9:30.
well, they came at 5:30 today, and some of them. So
Yeah, but they don't ever open before 11.
all right.
Even when they were doing testing, they only opened at 11.
So tomorrow. So Wednesday,
11
we'll do it 10.
o'clock. I don't know why in the world anybody was there. They really were angry at the people that came early because it was posted everywhere, 11 o'clock.
Yeah.
10 o'clock, you can start lining up.
They're pre-talking about the COVID thing.
Yeah.
I got mine today at Mayo.
Wonderful. Well, folks, it's a couple of minutes after 6:32. We'll give it one more minute and we'll begin. This is a very busy week here. I see we're having a Scholar Thursday, and I tell you, Judy is telling her friends that she has to make appointments to make phone calls with them because she's teaching and she's on Zoom. I have a virtual checkup with my doctor, so we're all seem to be, busy with one thing or another.
5:30 was a little while ago.
Raise the air conditioner. Lower.
It's fine.
No,
I'll get up in a
I think
minute.
it's in 73 for air.
It's fine.
Well, I think it's a good time to start. We've got a good group here, and let me go ahead and ask everyone to mute. I'm going to do an introduction. I'm going to do probably a large section, and then I'll wait for some
Hello.
questions. Yes. David, are you with us?
I just muted him.
Oh, well, I guess he'll be listening. Thank you. I'm going to ask that we try to stay with the questions and the conversation on most of the subjects that we are dealing with tonight. So if 2 or 3 times I say, well, we're going to get to that, this is not an infomercial to get you to come back to the next lecture. There's 2 more lectures and 2 more sessions, but to try to keep some continuity, or I may just address it very briefly. But I want to try to steer us so that we can cover some of this material. So again, let me begin. This all came out of my tenure at B'nai Abraham in Maryland, Hagerstown. I had a summer sabbatical of 3 months, and I was reading a couple of books, and it sort of fascinated me. One of our visiting professors in rabbinic school at Hebrew Union College in New York. Anybody from Philadelphia or Pennsylvania here? Oh, good. Did you remember Rabbi Bert Korn? He was, yeah, sure. What was that? Janie, you can unmute. So is that Mikveh Israel?
Yes, he
Oh,
was
it was connected.
Israel, and he's the one who married Jean and me.
Well, there you go. It's a small Jewish world. Well, he
Yes,
came and he gave a wonderful course on American Jewish history, and he was very, very charming. And, it's a congregational rabbi, not a rabbinic school professor. You know what I'm saying? And he had just a whole different style. And he had written a book that's one of the foundations on Jews and the Civil War. And I kind of got a little interested in it. So years later, when I was looking for a good subject, I said, well, we are in Tatum, Maryland was around the corner. It was about a 20-minute drive from us. And Gettysburg was about an hour and a quarter up in Pennsylvania. So, and we were close to Virginia, where there was a lot of action. And I learned very recently there was a big battle in Romney, Virginia, West Virginia. And that's a whole other story. We'll get to that with Judah Benjamin a little bit. So it was around me, and I started reading more, and I said, this would be an interesting kind of project, and worked out a very, very nice sabbatical with the congregation. And in terms of my time, I put some vacation time. They gave me extra time. And the whole point, and for all of you who are in leadership, if this should ever come up, the whole point was that there had to be outcomes, that the congregation needed to see some value. So one of the lectures was the basis for a Rosh Hashanah sermon. There was a couple of adult lectures. There was an interfaith one that I did on the chaplaincy controversy, which again we will get to, which interested the ministers and the whole origin of chaplains and Jews as chaplains and so forth. There was a religious school module I put together for the older kids. So it wound up, and then I spoke in a couple of other synagogues and have since. So the whole point was that this is something that had a number of applications, and I was enriched by it. And I hope you enjoy it. It raised a lot of questions. I will start off with a comment by a colleague of mine who was a minister. And he was inquiring, well, what did you do? And what did you pick? And I told him, Jews and the Civil War. He said what some congregants have said since then. Well, I would never put the two together. And that stuck with me because I think that's an important point to make. The Civil War is over here, military stuff, politics, slavery, Lincoln, Schminken. And here's the Jewish stuff over here. And yeah, I guess there were a couple of, but it's much more complicated and nuanced than that. So at any rate, let me get started here and start with, well, let's see, probably should start with glasses so I can actually see. That's useful. Old adage that you've heard again and again is if you want to write a best-selling American novel or make a hit movie, the best period is the Civil War. Whether it's Stephen Crane's book, The Red Badge of Courage, or the classic movie Gone with the Wind, I'm sure everyone's seen that, or Shenandoah, the great Jimmy Stewart movie. The Civil War area, I think, has an air of romance and nostalgia. It underscores regional differences and conflicts. It shows our young country maturing through war, suffering, and loss, and how everything changed in America after 1865. I think, too, the Civil War period is the best time frame to look at how Judaism developed in America, the before and after of the story of Jews in America. So we're in a new secular year, and so I'll share this, just some of what I learned during a sabbatical about the role and experience of Jews during the Civil War. My thesis is that so much of American Jewish life, politics, and religion then and now to a degree parallels things and trends now. I'm sure it will come up, but let's try to at least initially stay on track, because right now there are people who feel pro or con that we may be seeing potential for civil insurrection on a large scale now. But that was not my point when I wrote this. And so, but there are many things that are similar to what is going on today. A very brief, because you can't operate out of context. Let me give you an example. When I mention Jewish community, it's almost very, very difficult for me, and I'm sure for most of us, to think of Jewish community and not think of something like we have today. There's a federation, there are different organizations, there's Israel bonds, there's a shaliach. I mean, we just assume community is this wider grouping of people, however limited the numbers might be. But Jewish community back then, before the Civil War, was sparse. So I'm going to give you a very, very brief introduction to bring you up to what it was like in 1860. And I think much of this is not unknown to you. Esoteric, it's not. The earliest Jews in America, of course, Sephardic. There's some from Central European countries. Originally, maybe a total of 2,000, according to the first census back in 1790. By the time of the American Revolution, there were congregations only in New York, Newport, Rhode Island, Philadelphia, Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia. That's all in the whole country. Again, there may have been small groups, a handful here, maybe a million there, but congregations were just limited to those. But by 1850, sizable Jewish communities now existed. Cincinnati, Louisville, Kentucky, Baltimore, about 50,000 Jews with 37 synagogues in 11 states. So just to give you that. Now, from 1850 to 1860, almost 2 million immigrants, not Jewish immigrants, just immigrants, left Europe for three reasons. Somebody want to give me one? Where are my participants here? There they are.
Pogroms,
Hunger.
the pogroms
Okay.
that were taking place in Europe.
Okay, so one was anti-Semitism, lack of economic opportunity is a second. So it's opportunity in America, and specifically, and this is again interesting, politics. The failed liberal revolutions of
Right.
1848. When you
Exactly.
put those three things together, you see for those reasons. And again, not just Jews, not just Jews. I lived in South Carolina for 5 years when I first started rabbiing. And it was interesting to me to see, very quickly you learn sociology of religion, especially as a rabbi, you're very attentive to this. You see that in the lowlands around Charleston, they originally were Episcopalian and kind of more Lutheran, moderate Protestant denominations. Where I was in Greenville in the mountains was, still is today, heavily evangelical Baptist, because that's where the entire Reformation was there. The Midlands around Columbia, very German, very Lutheran. We had 2 Lutheran churches in Greenville, and there were about 20. And then there was a Lutheran seminary, which I took a couple of courses in pastoral counseling there. So the German non-Jews came to America for the same reasons that many Jews did. Economic opportunity, persecution politically, and there was some religious issues too as well, always has, I think, in Europe. So now American Jewry had tripled, 77 synagogues in 19 states and Washington, D.C. Large Jewish communities now included St. Louis, San Francisco, Boston, Cleveland, New Orleans, Newark, New Jersey, Milwaukee, Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago, all growing commercial or manufacturing centers. And again, Dr. Thorne, who wrote in his classic American Jewry in the Civil War, wrote that, quote, by 1860, the urban tendency of American Jews had already become fixed as a norm. Jewish urbanization began by the Civil War, not with the great immigration of Jews from Eastern Europe after 1880, which is what we tend to read. So one of the first trends from the Civil War that is just like today is increasing urbanization. A couple of you probably remember when Jacksonville was a small city, a medium-sized community. I don't know the numbers, but certainly in the early days, maybe up until the last 50, 60 years, small, medium-sized community. And now you find Jews in large numbers moving to all Florida, but to all cities and to Florida cities in large numbers, urbanization. So I think that's one trend that we can see, and it affects how things operate. So that's one thing. Yet there were essential differences in 1850 that were not like today. Virtually no rabbis. Well, some congregants might think that's a good idea, but there were none, and that presented some real problems. There were no seminaries, nor Jewish organizations like B'nai B'rith or ADL like we have today. We take that for granted. There was nothing. In short, there was no national American Judaism that existed, and the Civil War changed that. There were a few prominent lay spokesmen like Mordechai Noah and Judah Toro, and the first rabbis were not really ordained. Some had been trained as lay leaders, cantors, or shochet, ritual butchers, and they took the title of minister. I have an old copy of one of the original Union prayer books from 1917, and where the later Union prayer books, raise your hand if you remember seeing the Union prayer book. It usually had reader. This one had minister. We might even have a copy in the library. I'm sure you must. That was the term they used. Isaac Leeser came to Richmond from Germany and soon moved to the pulpit in Philadelphia, where he served for 39 years. Samuel Isaacs came from England to New York City, and these were two traditionalists who were later joined by Reform founder Isaac Mayer Wise in Cincinnati. Isaac Mayer Wise, of course, we know is the founder of Hebrew Union College and the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, which is the URJ. After a failed attempt at unifying all Jews, closer to home than in Maryland, David Einhorn left Budapest. And that's because the Austrian government ordered the Reform Temple to be closed because of his election as rabbi. There were a lot of politics in Europe. The Orthodox spread not just in Hungary and Germany and other places. The Reformists were revolutionaries. And so the governments, who are somewhat now authoritarian, did not look favorably upon reform, which, by the way, is why reform did not really catch on in Europe until recent years and decades. So he had to leave and came to Baltimore's Har Sinai in 1855, became the leader of the radical wing of reformers. Now, we always are telling rabbis, and I'm sure many of you involved in discussions, interfaith things, are always telling people, all Jews all don't think the same. We don't all pray the same. There are different groups, different denominations. And within the denominations, there are different emphases. They lean a little more traditionally or a little more progressively, what have you. But in those days, there was a radical reform group. And it seems that Einhorn was the linchpin of that. And he advocated such extreme reforms as elimination of all Hebrew in the service. And that was attacked by traditional Jews and by moderate reformers alike. So in that sense, it's a little like parallel today. He was one of the few Jewish abolitionists. Abolitionists sometimes had in many circles an anti-Semitic bent. And he engendered such hostility in slaveholding Maryland. Maryland was a slave state. He had to flee in the night with his family to Philadelphia, where he assumed the pulpit of Knesset Israel, and he never ever returned to Maryland. Einhorn shows us the extreme range of rabbinic responses to the political issues of the day. So that hasn't changed, has it? We're forced into these conversations. Stick to religion depends on how you perceive that. Lisa and Wise and Einhorn and Gottheil from Temple Emmanuel in New York City held very different positions on the election of 1860. Very different. I would wager that 98 or 97 or 99, 96% of Reform rabbis held a very similar position in the last election. And these are, of course, on slavery and on secession. And those two go hand in hand. Each of these rabbis, we won't get into a huge amount of detail, but it's important to understand this. Each promoted their views in Jewish newspapers, in periodicals, often small ones that they themselves had started, or in the public press. So there was a Wise, who was the founder of Reform Judaism, was a moderate Democrat whose base was in the Midwest and in the South. He advocated compromise on slavery, on succession, and the war. Didn't know that. Einhorn, one of the few Jewish abolitionists, along with Felsenthal, took an extreme position on slavery and supported Lincoln forcing the South back into the Union through war. Religious doctrine, such as the Torah's true position on slavery, was debated amid great controversy. There was a reverend, actually these are rabbis, use the title, George Jacobs and Michelbacher, both of Richmond, Virginia, defended slavery. Both owned slaves. Jewish individuals, Jewish leaders, and rabbis all took positions based on their personal politics. I don't think that's changed much. And it depended on whether one was a Democrat or Republican or one of the last of the former Whigs. Just like today. Sound familiar? Robert Rosen is an attorney born in Charleston, South Carolina. He authored an extraordinary 450-page, thoroughly researched and documented book, The Jewish Confederates. He, in fact, had contracted with a military historian to do much of the background research. He generously had a telephone interview with me and then extended a long personal meeting in his office in Charleston. His view, and I think this is a fair statement, a big problem in dealing with this era is that we Jews, and not just us, everybody, tend to look back at the time through the lenses of our own current ideology, despite the history. I'm going to repeat that sentence because I think it's true. And I may have to come back to it again as we go through this. We Jews tend, and so I'm only dealing with Jews, other people, that's their business. We tend to look back at that time through lenses of our own current ideology, despite the history. For example, slavery was nearly universally defended by Jews of the South, not entirely, but nearly universally. But some Southern Jews did not believe in it or freed their own slaves. But slavery was not universally opposed by Northern Jews. We tend to think in these diametric categories. It's uncomfortable to think of Jews, Southern or Northern, defending slavery in America as late as 1860. Because it goes against our basic values and views. This is not in any way that we should justify slavery, but we have to look at history to be, completely in the clear here. Regarding secession and the war, Rabbis Lilienthal of Cincinnati, Adler and Felsenthal of Chicago, Isaacs of New York, and Einhorn, and the hawkish Sabato Marias of Philadelphia supported the Union cause enthusiastically, while Rabbi Lisa of New York was a sincere neutralist. Wise, who treasured peace above preserving the Union, was anti-war and a Southern sympathizer. So that's something to think about. In some ways, it's helpful, I think, to think of the 1860s in a way, in a limited way, as the 1960s, with radical dissent and controversy among Jews that reflected what was going on in the rest of the nation. Remember 1968, the trial of the Chicago Seven? Remember that era? And Judge Julius Hoffman and demonstrator Abby Hoffman, both Jews. I think there's a movie or a Netflix thing that's coming out about Abby Hoffman. I'm not sure. And it was kind of puzzling at the time. In some ways still is. A third issue is the role Jews played in American public life during the Civil War, government and in the military. And I will tell you that much of what I did focused on the South for some very interesting reasons, which we will get into. But according to one estimate, 4 to 5% of the Jewish population served in the military, as many as 10,000 Jews. This is contrary to the canard of author Mark Twain, who we all enjoy, who years later wrote that he hardly saw a Jew fighting in the army. Mel Young wrote a book called Where They Lie. It documents Union and Confederate Jewish casualties, and it's an important source for Jewish history of that era. When the war broke out, there was even a move to form an all-Jewish unit. I'll give you a couple examples. In Syracuse, New York, a Jewish company was organized and outfitted in 1862. And a few weeks before, in Chicago, a full complement of 96 men joined the Jewish company of the newly formed Illinois 82nd Regiment. In the Confederacy, 2 Jewish units were formed, one at West Point, Georgia, that's on the Alabama border. I think there's some textile mills there now, have been. That was the first month of the war. And then there was a second Jewish company at Macon, Georgia, in 1862 to help defend Savannah. Other units, like Company D of the 8th New York Regiment, had large numbers of Jews, but overwhelmingly, Jewish soldiers preferred to serve as individuals, even if that meant sacrificing Jewish institutions and opportunities for dietary laws. So, for instance, 15 of the 99 light infantry blues of Richmond were Jews. And in 1864, Lieutenant Ezekiel Levy became the commanding officer. But serve Jews did, and they were wounded and died in large numbers on both sides. According to the attorney Rosen, quote, there were Jewish Confederate casualties in every major engagement of the war. 10 at Shiloh, 7 at Seven Pines, 6 at Vicksburg, 6 at Spotsylvania, 12 defending Atlanta, and at least 20 buried in the notorious Union prison camp at Elmira, New York. I had never heard of Elmira, New York prison camp. We all know about Andersonville, of course, in the South. And I think it's similar for the Union. Some Jews remains were buried at home, but most were interred in unmarked graves, along with their fellow Christian soldiers. At Antietam, Maryland, the bloodiest one-day conflict in the history of the nearly 22,000 casualties in Union. Jewish soldiers included Major Albert Arndt of New York, along with 7 Confederate Jews, including Louis Mertz. Mertz is interesting. It's interesting to read a little about the background of who these people were and how they came to be there. Mertz had enlisted after emigrating from Bavaria. He fought with the West Point, Georgia Guards of D.H. Hill's division, and he was killed early in the battle by the Little Brick Church. Again, just hands, how many have been to Antietam? How many have been to Gettysburg? Both very, very magnificent, interesting, and somber places. Anyway, Union officers decide to bury Mertz in an unmarked grave. A.F. Wolf of Texas died of wounds at Antietam and was buried in the Confederate cemetery in Hagerstown. Young writes, quote, "The Hagerstown, Maryland Confederate Cemetery is a long way from Houston. Someone should say Kaddish for this Jewish soldier of the Confederacy who unselfishly gave his life." And the congregation in Hagerstown had been around for, founded early 1900s. Never knew that. I never knew that. So, and they have their own Jewish cemetery too. So many others, many Jewish families were divided. They had relatives fighting on opposite sides. Politically, unfortunately, a bit like today. Abraham Jonas served in the legislature of Kentucky and in Illinois. He knew Abraham Lincoln well. He had 6 sons. 4 wore gray, the 5th blue, and the youngest was briefly in the Louisiana militia. They had distinguished war records and promotions. After the war, one of his sons, Benjamin Franklin Jonas, was elected city attorney of New Orleans. And in 1876, U.S. Senator, the first practicing Jew elected to the Senate. In the South, many held government positions. Edwin Warren Moyes was a Confederate district judge in Louisiana. Samuel Hyams served as a provost marshal in Mississippi. And Jacob D. Cordova was the tax collector for a Confederate district in Texas. David de Leon of Columbia, South Carolina, was Jefferson Davis's special envoy. Later was dismissed when letters of his mission to France and England fell into Union hands. He had been outmaneuvered by Louisiana rival Slidell and another famous Jew, Judah Benjamin. I'm almost concluded with Judah Benjamin's biography. Very, very interesting material. I'll briefly touch upon him now, but we'll want to come back to him in detail. He was the Confederate Secretary of War, the Secretary of State, was the acting Secretary of War, Secretary of State, because of his close connection with Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy. Judah Benjamin was a former senator from Louisiana. He was known as the brains of the Confederacy, but in the North, his Jewish ancestry was the focus of hatred. When the war went badly, Southern anti-Semites like Confederate Congressman Foote, Tennessee, blamed, quote, the Jew, unquote. Judah had intermarried and given up his Jewish identity, but it had not given up on him. And I think that's another Civil War truth that is just like now. After the war, Jefferson Davis and David Yulee Levy of Florida, former U.S. Senator from Florida, he was a Confederate leader who denied being Jewish. They served the longest terms in federal prison. But Judah Benjamin managed to escape through Florida and the Caribbean to England, where he became ultimately a successful and honored barrister. He never returned to America, but his life story and his skills and his personality are a very interesting. Got a little bit more, but I think this is a good time to stop and see what questions you may have at this point.
Can we unmute David, because he was going to do the introduction and welcome you on behalf of the Adult Ed Committee?
Oh,
I don't
sure.
think he can unmute himself.
Okay, thank you, Jill. Where's David?
He's on the phone.
I'll wait.
Let's see. Do you have control? Can you unmute him?
I can try.
I asked him to unmute, Jill.
Okay, maybe he doesn't know how. There he goes. Okay.
I'm already unmuted.
I'm sorry.
Hello?
I'm watching two meetings at the same time.
I'm unmuted, I think.
You
Yes,
are.
unmuted.
Okay. Thank you for joining us. I'm David Sellen, a member of the Adult Education Committee. Tonight we're going to have the first of 3 sessions on the Jewish experience in the Civil War. Our presenter is Adjunct Rabbi Fred Raskind. Rabbi Raskind is retired, but generously donates some of his time to the temple. He did this beneficiaries of his work, and we thank him in advance for doing this. Rabbi, I turn it over to you. Of course, this was supposed to be in the beginning, but there it is.
Well, you just turned it back to me, but actually, I think everybody knows me and knows who I am, and I gave you some background. I'm going to take this chance to ask Jill, did I send to Ellen the bibliography? I think I sent her that. If not, I will resend it. That's something we can post between if people want to, or at the end, it doesn't matter. It's no required reading. But if people would like to know some of the sources, or if they wanted to do some follow-up reading, they can follow that. So if not, remind me and I will. I know I sent you the that prepared the Jewish experience in the Civil War and some of the themes that we will be getting into as we move forward. Any questions?
John Hill has his hand up.
John?
Not so much a question, Rabbi, but I am privileged to have a copy of the Rosen book.
Oh, great.
Great. Interesting on the cover photograph, I guess it was a commissioned painting for the book. But the acting commander of the 12th Alabama at Gettysburg was Major Oscar Proskauer. I guess the colonels were missing for some reason, promotion being rapid in those days. But I remember reading the diarist comment that, this was a non-Jewish commentator saying that our Jew major just stood there with a cigar, just as the bullets whizzed around him.
I get to that a little later on. Yeah,
Okay,
it's one of the interesting things. And you may have really come in at a good time on this, John, because again, I mentioned a little earlier why it's so Southern central, so Confederate central, not because I have a Confederate flag or any of that business. It's because Jews were, for a whole bunch of reasons we'll get into, able to proceed far and take leadership roles because of their positions in the society and in the military prior. So that really underscores that the percentage of Jews who had positions before, during the war, in the Confederacy, and after. And we'll talk more about that. Thank you. Anybody else?
That's good.
Any questions? Any concerns?
I don't have any other hands up, Rabbi.
Oh, wait, Bob's there. Bob does. Bob, you have to unmute.
Were these Reformed, Orthodox, or Conservative? Does it make a difference back then?
Well, there was no reform to speak of. It was very embryonic, and those were the earliest days. There was no conservative movement until later. Orthodoxy wasn't, again, there was no union of orthodoxy. There was no head rabbis or no vads and kosher commissions. It was really pretty much entrepreneurial Judaism. And the default was tradition and whatever traditions they would rescue or bring over from Europe. And as I pointed out in Reform, it was, the word I use is embryonic, it was just growing. And they were experimenting with many things. There were conferences in Europe. So there wasn't that structure of those denominations, and certainly not conservative. But this was all to start happening in a developing way after the war. I think, who has their hand up?
I have a question.
Yes,
You had mentioned that something about dietary laws, and I'm wondering if they were able to continue the dietary laws.
most weren't, but I have a couple of anecdotes next time about that. They just couldn't. And many Jews, by the way, either didn't or wouldn't or couldn't follow that. There were no shachats, there were no kosher, there were no U labels on things. And so again, that was, but many did. There were some stories of soldiers who just wouldn't eat any meat. That's all.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes. Unmute. Sophia, you have to unmute.
Got it. Is it because most of the Jews, they were Sephardic, they weren't Ashkenazi, and they do have a lot of differences between themselves?
At
So,
the time Civil War started, okay, there were numbers of Sephardic and people who had Sephardic ancestors who had been there in America first, very early. You can tell that from the names I was reading, the Dekova, the Sephardic names. But there were also increasing numbers of Jews from Central Europe, mostly Germany, Austria, Bohemia. So they were both and. I didn't do an ethnic breakdown, but they really were both. And of course, after 1850, 1860, more and more and more Jews came from Central Europe. And then the great wave of Eastern European Jews started in the late 1870s, 80s, and 90s. But at this time, there were still descendants of the original generation or two of Sephardic Jews, other Sephardic Jews who came over to America from Mediterranean countries. And in fact, Judah Benjamin himself was one, and so was Yuli. They were born in the Caribbean. So that's another point we may want to revisit this idea as we go forward and look at some of the backgrounds of some of the people. Yes. Okay. Do I see a diamond with a hand up, or are you just? I thought I saw. Do you want to? I can't tell whether you're looking to comment, Harold. No. Okay. Wonderful. All right. Well, if we have no more comments, let me continue. So, prior to the Civil War, let's talk about something we all are talking about, unfortunately, more and more and more, that we wish we weren't talking about more and more and more, and that is anti-Semitism. And this may be cause for concern and some questions, but prior to the Civil War, anti-Semitism, for the most part, was low key. And that probably is because the critical mass of Jews was so small in most communities, that there really wasn't that kind of threat that fueled much of anti-Semitism. But the economic pressures, the hostilities of an increasingly unpopular war brought forth terrible anti-Semitic reactions in Congress, in the cabinet, and in the military command. Senator Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln as president, called Yulee. David Yulee was the senator of Jewish background. He denied it. He didn't admit he was Jewish, but his original name was David Yulee Levy, L-E-V-Y. So I leave it up to you. Senator Andrew Johnson called him the contemptible little Jew, unquote. And then also he said, there's another Jew, that miserable Benjamin. There's no question he shouldn't like Yulee and he shouldn't like Benjamin. But notice how they attach that, not because they're Confederates or traitors or rebels, but because they're Jews. Interesting, Johnson himself, as I'm sure you've been reading lately, avoided impeachment conviction in the Senate by a single vote. There were a couple of other parties besides the Democrats, the Whigs, and the new Republican group. It was called the Know Nothing Party. And it was in the 1850s. It started as a reaction to Andrew Jackson. It opposed immigration, but it was also anti-Black, anti-Catholic. Because so many Jews were recent immigrants, anti-Jewish. What surprised me was the extent to which the Civil War era newspapers published and promulgated anti-Jewish charges and slurs. I think selling newspapers then was more important than unbiased reporting. And some would say just like today. But it was very, very graphic, very, very different. And this, of course, you're reading some of these right-wing things that are very graphic. There are three great issues that remain. First, Lincoln's relationship with the Jews, we'll talk about later on. I was speaking with a high school colleague and friend of mine, Mike Calafatis. Went to high school together, and Mike wound up going to Brandeis and was given scholarships. Bright guy, and very interesting man. He wound up taking the job in the counselor's office and helping with admissions. And I'd been all over the South doing stuff like this and lost touch with him, as is often the case. He wound up becoming the director of admissions for Brandeis for 25 years. And has some wonderful stories. Well, he mentioned to me that, where were we? This. What did Mike tell me? I'll have to come back to that. That just slipped out of my mind. Oh, yes.
We're on Lincoln.
Of course. No, I've got it. He told me that he was early on interviewed a young guy who was coming in as a freshman to Brandeis. He said he was brilliant. He was absolutely brilliant. He knew so much and he was so well read and in history and so on. And he did. And he wound up going to Brandeis, graduating top of the group and getting his doctorate and coming back, and he teaches history at Brandeis, Jonathan Sarna. And of course, he's written the book about Lincoln. And I haven't read that book, but that will be my next about Lincoln and the Jews. So that's a whole other story. I will be dealing with a small piece of that, but there's an entire field here. It's not just a few issues. So that's the first, Lincoln and the Jews. A second key event was the chaplain's controversy over the appointment as rabbis as Jewish military chaplains for the Union. Ultimately, Jewish chaplains were commissioned, provided they were ordained. I've discussed this with other chaplains about the role of the federal military appointments and qualifications. In the Confederacy, a few Jewish chaplains like Reverend Michelbacher of Richmond had been appointed. So it was not an issue in the South, it was a big issue in the North, again, for some reasons. And the third, and I'm sure if you've done any reading or talking about this, you probably know that something about Grant's General Order number 11. Okay. I can't get into enormous detail, but we do have time for some back and forth on this. And the reason it's so important, it represents the single most egregious incident of a U.S. government anti-Semitic policy. December 17, 1862, Grant ordered all Jews as a class expelled from the Department of Tennessee. The Department of Tennessee, it's like the region, included Tennessee, of course, Kentucky, and Mississippi. There had been speculating and extensive trading with the Confederacy, and to be sure, and to be honest, some Jews had been involved. Congress should have banned all trading, but it didn't for political reasons. Surprise. Just like today. The order affected even the loyal pro-Union Jews of Paducah, Kentucky, including two who had served enlistments in the Union Army. Caesar Kaskel, Kaskel, worked through channels, and eventually he gained a meeting with President Lincoln. Lincoln had the order rescinded. But the key to this, and this is really important, was that northern Jewish communities rose in outrage. They wrote letters to Congress, and they managed to raise the debate to the national level. It caused a great controversy, and it affected Grant's candidacy for president in 1868. It turns out that Grant came to see the error of his ways. He apologized, and he was pretty much accepted by the Jewish community, who in huge numbers did vote for him. So that's a very interesting turn. But what made this so egregious is that it was an official political military act on behalf of the government, on behalf of the military. And it affected all Jews regardless of their background, their politics, their loyalty, but not anybody else. Somebody want to comment on that? React to it? Yeah, John.
I remember a professor of mine, I was at University of North Florida, and we were discussing indirectly anti-Semitism, but prejudice in general against particular groups. And I mentioned, of course, we talked a little bit about Jews in the South, and she said, there's an interesting thing, and you touched on it a little bit, of course, depending on the numbers, that if the numbers were small, they were seen as, and her word was exotic. And because of the small numbers, now because of economic and social pressures, probably the Civil War exacerbated whatever tensions there were to the level you're talking about. And, you know, ancient hatred start coming back up again. So that may have had some bearing on it, particularly when you have prominent people like Judah Benjamin, who's out there and kind of I mean, literally he's the second in command of the Confederate States. I mean, if you read, I've read the same biography, can't think of the guy's name, Eli Evans' biography.
Well, Evans, yeah.
And which you'll probably get back into, but he became a focal point because of his connection and because he was so visible and so active as it was. So that was just an observation she made, is that because of one, small numbers initially, but then now because of all these pressures and animosity, well, let's pick on somebody. Who else? I'll leave the question with that. Thank you.
Well, that's a good point. Thank you. Anybody else?
Yes, this is Paula. I'm given to understand that Grant wrote the order because his father was involved and had many Jewish friends who were supporting him. And in order to protect his father, he felt that he could get rid of the Jews out of the state, and his father's ability to do what he was doing would dissolve. Have you heard?
Yeah, that was a piece of it, sure. Again, does that sound like today, where people make political and military decisions based on self-interest and on what's good for their family and what's good for their position, sure. That's what it is.
This is Annie Bear. Were there any people, any of the Jews, did they have to leave before it was rescinded?
Oh, yeah.
And did they ever get their property back?
The property, as I understand, unless it was the cotton, the goods, but the homes, I don't think were confiscated.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Well, let's continue. We're gonna think of another couple things. It's kind of difficult and it's not wise necessarily neither to avoid nor to over compare that to what's going on today. I think the anti-Semitism that we're seeing today may have some common roots, but I think at the same time, they may be very different and operating on different levels. But it still does give us cause to think. I think there are 3 lessons that emerge out of order number 11. And that is when it comes to Jewish equality and rights, we have to stand up and stand together to confront against us. We should not be afraid to speak out. One of the arguments, and we see this certainly in the traditional community, but in others, about religious freedom, yet one of the great laws in Jewish tradition, going back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and you can talk with Rabbi Goodman and some of the other rabbis who are far more versed in halacha than I am, but the basic point is dina malchuta dina, the law, the secular law of the land is the law. We can't say, well, we Jews, we have to have an exception for this because that's a tradition. So long as it's equal and fair, it is not pointed against Jews. If it is simply a rule, we must follow the secular authority, not on ritual matters, but on social and political matters. What if Caesar Casco had not pushed to see Lincoln? To answer your question about the Jews of the Tennessee Department. And I think it's just as critical today that we make alliances where we can, as we can, to protect our rights and our interests, just like other groups do. And third, in 1864, Charleston and Savannah were nearly starving. They had no means of preparing for Pesach. They solicited help from the Jews of Philadelphia and New York, and over 5,000 pounds of foodstuffs were contributed because Jews help each other in times of trouble, regardless of politics. I think for the experience of Civil War Jewry, both North and South, this teaches us a lesson that in many ways we want to make a comment about that. Anything related to that. We have a few minutes. Anything related to this topic? Okay. I'm going to go ahead and hold
Excuse
the
me.
next lecture for next week. Yes.
It's very true what you say. We have to be united. Look, when the Russian Jews couldn't get out, We were united then, and that was the last time, I think, in my belief, that we were really united, and we were effective. Eventually, you got the Jackson-Varick Amendment to allow them to leave and everything. So we have to be united, but we're too much friction amongst us, especially with the youth.
Sorry, Anna, you faded out, especially with,
The youth of today.
yeah. Well, and not only the youth, we have differences of emphasis. What's important in other segments of the Jewish community is not important with others.
Right.
You have generational differences, you have political differences. We've become a very fragmented and diverse Jewish community today.
Correct. Correct. Yep.
And that's not going to change. I mean, we've been hearing that. I've been hearing it for 30 or 40 years. We need to be unified. We need to be unified, but the reasons we're not. And many of them are good reasons. We have to learn to make alliances. We need to learn to make alliances. And we don't always do that as well. We like to stay within our comfort zone. I remember 10, 15 years ago, I really made a plea that we needed to spend a little more time having conversations with the evangelical community with whom we share evangelical Christians, except for Orthodox Jews, are the most committed to supporting Israel of any group in America. I don't necessarily agree with their approach to theology, but or the politics necessarily, but on that's something we should have spent more time. And there are a small number of leaders and rabbis. For most of us, we want to talk to folks who talk, think, vote, and act, and hang out like we do. And that's
He's frozen. Rabbi's frozen.
He is completely dropped from the meeting at this point. So we'll give him a minute to see if he realizes he's disconnected and see if he can get back on.
I don't know what happened to the rabbi's computer, but very early in this session, Windows, for some unknown reason, just rebooted my computer. So I had to start over again.
Huh.
Nothing I did at all. I just had this message saying there's something wrong.
Am I back?
You are back.
Am I back?
You're back. You're back, Rabbi.
Finally. Lord have mercy. So anyway, that's an outlier point of view, but I think that's something that we should have conversations with. There are many different views on Israel, on two-state solution, views just to the opposite. At one time, we had within the Reform community, certainly, nearly complete agreement on how we should deal with Israel and what the priorities are and what Israel should do and what we should do. That's not true today. Not true at all. So that's part of the problem. And how do you have conversations with people who you don't have conversations with on other things? That's a challenge for everybody. Well, are there any further questions for tonight?
I don't see any hands up, electronic hands. Oh, John just raised his real hand. John?
I don't want to steal your thunder, Rabbi. You're very good at this because you and I have talked before.
Steal away. It's all available. We're here to share.
Well, actually, now I backed into being a Civil War buff because people kept giving me stuff, but the Jewish portion of it, which I backed into indirectly, was studying Medal of Honor recipients, because there are 39, of which only one is still alive at this point. But I found 6 from the Civil War. So I do know the name of the first one, Leopold Karpelus, and you'll probably get back to this, so I don't want to steal your thunder on that. But
go ahead, go right ahead.
He was the color sergeant for the 57th Massachusetts, and during the battle at I think it was it Spotsylvania? I'm trying to remember. No, Wilderness. This was the Wilderness. All those battlefields are all fairly closely located.
Oh, I know.
But because if you've ever been out to the Wilderness, they're not joking. It is still pretty heavily wooded, and I would hate to be out there without a compass, because it's pretty thick out there. And in the middle of the battle, and of course, in a Civil War battlefield, you can hardly see anything because of the smoke from the weapons. And so in a few minutes, the one thing you can see are the regimental colors, and his regiment started to break. And he realized if I move, the regiment will fall apart. So he stood there with the colors while every Confederate who could see him tried to kill him. And some of those Confederates, I'm also equally sure, were Jews. But that's what the highest number of Medal of Honor awards, particularly in the Civil War, went to color sergeants who stayed there and risked their lives to get shot at, or seized enemy colors or recovered American colors, the U.S. standard. I'm thinking of one Confederate regiment lost 13 color sergeants in 20 minutes. Every time one of them picked the flag up, he got shot. And so Karpelus stood there for however long it took for the regiment to be reformed. And that's an example of several, but that was a job you didn't want in the Civil War, as being a color sergeant. So he's number 1. And that's what kind of prompted my interest in connecting the two. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you. No, I did not have that as part of, there's so many stories and so many dimensions. And if you're interested in military strategy or into the details of the battles, that's one aspect. If you're interested in the social stuff, the book on Judah Benjamin is interesting. He was interesting, but it really gives some color to what life was like in the South during the Civil War and in Richmond and among the people. And it's not gone with the wind. It's not all gone with the wind. So yeah, that does help us kind of focus on that piece of it. And there were Jews who were heroes. Many, many, many won honors and were great heroes and great leaders. But we'll get into some of that in the next couple of sessions. Well, I'm going to propose then, if there are no questions, we just knock off a little early. I know Ron and I don't want to miss the Alabama-Ohio State games. So we have more Civil War 2 weeks from tonight. And I thank you for your participation and interest. I think it's important to have gotten some of these basic trends and these contexts, I call them, settled, so we can get into this in a little bit more detail. But you may want to be thinking about the question I asked, not just about Jewish communities and the experience, but the whole question of anti-Semitism, which has been raised to a whole new level just last Wednesday. We always knew there were these crazy extremist groups, and but I don't know about you, and I've seen an enormous amount. Seeing that fellow with the beard and the Camp Auschwitz T-shirt.
Oh, terrible.
And, yeah, and then there was another one I didn't see, but I heard the 6 MWE, 6 million weren't enough.
Right.
Is yeah. There's going to be more to say and do about it. I spent about 3 hours a day the last week reading the number of papers and articles, and it's still coming up. And let's hope and pray that we can get through another week without any more of this, though. There's fears that there's going to be some more interruptions and problems. But we will get through this. The problem with revolutions and the problem with extremists on either side, you see this on the left with Russia and so on, is once this stuff gets going, guess who's next in line?
The Jews.
Yeah, first it's the blacks, and then it's these cases with the Know Nothing Party of 150 years ago, the immigrants. But sooner or later, anybody who's other, anybody who's different, as John pointed out, anybody whose profile is high and is vulnerable and is a good scapegoat, there are people who are very good at shifting that to that. So let us hope and pray that we can meet a week from Monday, 2 weeks from tonight, I think. Yes, and have happier news along those lines. And then we will pick it up. We're going to be dealing with some of the questions of religion and observance and a lot of the fun stuff. And I picked some profiles for the third one on February 8th. Some interesting characters and some fun stories. So that will be a nice way to kind of look at some very interesting individuals beyond the military and beyond the problems that they had to deal with. Thank you very much. Have a good night, a good week.
Rabbi.
John wants to say, oh, y'all just saying goodbye? All right.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you very much. Look for y'all in a couple of weeks.
Thank you. Stay safe.
Thank
Stay
you.
safe.
Stay safe,
You
everybody.
too. Be well.
Good night, everyone.
Night, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Night.
Thank
Good
you,
night.
Mary Ellen.
You're
Thanks for
welcome.
your help. Bye-bye.
You're
Thanks,
welcome.
Mary
Good night.
Thanks, Jill.
Good night.
Ron,
Thank you, Rabbi.
see you.
Roll Tide.
Roll Tide. You got that right. Bye-bye
Bye.
now.